Okay, get this. A giant flying scroll that's delivering a curse. And then a woman, literally named Wickedness, who gets sealed in a basket and flown away. These are the strange and powerful visions from Zechariah chapter 5. We're going to break them down verse by verse to really understand what the prophet saw and what it all means. So, let's dive in.
Yeah, the prophet Zechariah saw some truly strange things, didn't he? It can all seem a little out there at first glance. So let's break down what these symbols are really about, starting with that first vision.
All right, so the first vision is found in verses 1 through 4. And right away, Zechariah's attention gets yanked towards this massive, mysterious object that's just flying through the air.
So verse 1 just throws us right into the deep end, Boom, a flying scroll. An angel even asks Zechariah, hey, what are you seeing? And the prophet's answer in the very next verse, well, it tells you just how big this thing really was.
Okay, so in verse 2, we get the specs, 20 cubits by 10 cubits. Now, what does that even mean? We're talking about something that's 30 feet long and 15 feet wide. Think about that. That's the size of a small building. This was not some tiny little note. It was this gigantic, impossible-to-ignore billboard of judgment flying over the whole land.
And the angel in verse 3, he doesn't mince words. It's pretty chilling, actually. He says this isn't just some random object floating by. Nope, this scroll represents God's judgment against some very specific sins that are just poisoning the entire land. This curse has a purpose, and it has a target. And the curse is super specific. It's written on both sides, and it's aimed squarely at two sins that just eat away at the fabric of a society: theft and making false promises in God's name. I mean, think about it. For a community trying to rebuild after being in exile, trust and justice were absolutely everything. These sins rotted that foundation to the core. The commentator Matthew Henry put it really well. He said, this vision is this powerful, almost tangible picture of God's righteous anger against sin. It's not just some abstract idea here. It's a visible, menacing presence. And then verse 4 describes the terrifying result. Look, this curse is not just a slap on the wrist. It is an all-consuming force that enters the sinner's house and literally dismantles it from the inside out. We're talking timber, stones, everything. The point couldn't be clearer. This judgment is total.
Okay, so if the flying scroll was all about judging sinful actions, the second vision, which kicks off in verse 5, gets even weirder. It shows us how the very source of that sin gets dealt with on a much grander scale. The prophet next sees something called an ephah. Now, what's an ephah? Well, it was basically a big basket, right? It held maybe 5 to 10 gallons. It was used all the time in the marketplace for measuring out grain. So right off the bat, we're seeing a symbol that's tied to business, to the economy.
And what's inside this commercial basket? Verse 8 tells us it's a woman. And the angel leaves absolutely no room for interpretation. He says, point blank, this is wickedness. We're not talking about just a sinful person. This is the very concept of sin, personified.
The vision then unfolds in this really dramatic three-part sequence. First, this woman, Wickedness, is forced into the basket. Then, a heavy lead lid is just slammed on top, sealing her inside. Finally, two powerful winged women appear, lift the entire container, and carry it away. It's a very clear picture of containment and removal.
This slide really helps us decode all the symbolism, right? The ephah, a tool of commerce, points to corrupt economic systems. The woman is moral corruption personified. That heavy lead cover represents God's final weighty judgment that contains the sin. And those strange winged figures are supernatural agents of removal, taking wickedness to a very specific destination.
And that destination, which we find out about in verse 11, is so crucial. The ephah is taken to the land of Shinar. Biblically, this is ancient Babylon, the location of the Tower of Babel. It's the symbolic heartland of organized human rebellion against God.
So, what's the big picture when we put these two incredibly vivid visions together? What's the unified message here?
The two visions deliver a single powerful message about God's two-part process. First, the flying scroll shows God judging the actions of sin, theft, false oaths. Second, the woman in the ephah shows God removing the underlying source of corruption itself, exiling it back to its symbolic home. It's a total spiritual cleansing.
And as this slide illustrates, this isn't an isolated story. It's a key link in a chain that runs throughout the entire Bible. The story of rebellion begins in Shinar with the Tower of Babel in Genesis, and it culminates with the final judgment of Babylon in Revelation. Zechariah's vision sits right in the middle, showing God's ongoing plan to purify his people.
So, what are the crucial points we should take away from this ancient text? What does this vision of judgment and exile mean for us?
You know, seeing these visions of harsh, consuming judgment should remind us of the seriousness of sin. But the intended response isn't to gloat over the downfall of others. Instead, it's a call to pray for mercy, hoping that no one has to face this kind of judgment unprepared.
And that leaves us with a final, provocative thought. The vision ends in verse 11, with wickedness being established in Shinar, set upon its own base in its own house. It's given a place of honor. And it makes you wonder, what does it look like when a culture or a system decides to build a permanent home for wickedness, making it foundational to its very identity?